The day Richard Vale collapsed in the middle of his own award speech, the last person he expected to see walking toward him was his daughter, Elena. The daughter he had trained, the daughter he had underestimated, the daughter whose name had quietly replaced his in boardrooms across the city. And as the room filled with screams and shattered glasses, Richard looked up at her with fear in his eyes, because in that single terrible moment, he finally understood what she had done. But by then, it was far too late. 5 years earlier, Elena Vale was the first to arrive at Vale Strategic every morning and the last to leave every night. She was 30, sharp, disciplined, and so loyal it hurt to watch. The employees called her the Shadow CEO, but never where Richard could hear. Officially, Richard Vale was the founder and face of the consultancy. He was the kind of man business magazines loved: tailored suits, silver hair, calm voice, ruthless instincts. He had built his firm from nothing after Elena's mother died when Elena was only 9. That was the story he told the world. The part he never told anyone was that Elena had grown up in the empty spaces his ambition left behind. She ate birthday cake with assistants. She did homework in conference rooms. She learned to read financial statements before she learned how to grieve. And still, she loved him. That was the tragedy of it. Even after all the missed school plays, the canceled dinners, the way he introduced her to clients as "my daughter, she helps out sometimes," even though she was the one fixing contracts at midnight and rescuing accounts he nearly lost, Elena still wanted one thing: for her father to look at her and say, "I couldn't have built this without you." But Richard never said that. He said things like, "Don't be emotional in meetings. You're talented but not battle-tested. You still have a lot to learn." And the worst one? The one that stayed in her chest like glass. "You have my name. That opens doors. Don't confuse that with earning respect." She had earned everything. He just refused to see it. At Vale Strategic, Elena wasn't just an employee. She was the reason the company still breathed. When senior consultants failed to secure a manufacturing account, Elena stayed up all weekend rebuilding the client strategy from scratch and saved it. When a public relations disaster threatened a government partnership, Elena drafted the recovery plan that turned a near scandal into a case study in crisis management. When Richard lost his temper in negotiations and nearly destroyed a merger, Elena stepped in with a softer voice, a better read on people, and salvaged millions. But in every press interview, Richard said, "My team executed my vision." His vision, never hers. At home, things were even quieter. Richard lived in a penthouse filled with expensive art and no warmth. Elena stopped by every Sunday with groceries because he forgot to eat when he was working. She organized his prescriptions because he kept misplacing them. She even changed the batteries in the clocks because he never noticed time unless it was billable. Sometimes she would stand in his kitchen holding 2 cups of coffee, looking at the back of his head while he typed on his laptop, and think, "Just turn around. Just once. Turn around and ask me how I am." He almost never did. The only person in the company who truly saw Elena was Marcus Lynn, the finance director. Marcus was older, careful with his words, and kind in a way that didn't ask for credit. One night, after everyone else had left, he found Elena alone in the conference room staring at a client retention report. "You're bleeding yourself dry for a company that still calls you junior leadership," he said gently. Elena didn't look up. "It's my father's company." Marcus was quiet for a moment. Then he asked, "Is it?" That question haunted her. It followed her into elevators, through client dinners, into sleepless nights. Is it? Because the more Elena looked around, the more she saw the truth. The company Richard claimed as his own had become a monument to old instincts and borrowed labor. He still believed fear was leadership. He still thought loyalty could be demanded instead of earned. He still dismissed younger staff, mocked flexible thinking, and rejected anything that didn't sound like the business world of 20 years ago. But Elena had been quietly building something else inside those same walls. Relationships, trust, a reputation. Clients didn't ask for Richard's insight anymore. They asked if Elena would be in the meeting. She noticed it before he did. And that was when the guilt began. It would have been easier if Richard had been cruel all the time. But he wasn't. Sometimes he'd leave half a sandwich on her desk because he remembered she skipped lunch. Sometimes he'd say, without looking at her, "Good save in there." Once, after she nailed a difficult presentation, he stood in the doorway of her office and almost smiled. "Your mother used to prepare that way," he said. Then he walked off before she could answer. That was the problem. He gave her crumbs in the language of love, and she starved on them for years. Then came the meeting that changed everything. Vail Strategic was pitching for the biggest contract in company history, a multinational logistics transformation deal that would triple annual revenue and make Richard's legacy untouchable. Elena built the strategy. Every slide, every forecast, every operational recommendation. She knew the client's pain points so intimately, it was like she could hear them breathing. The night before the presentation, she walked into Richard's office with the final deck. He took it from her, scanned the first few pages, and nodded. "Good," he said. "Tomorrow, sit in and take notes." She blinked. "Take notes?" "I'll present." Elena laughed once, because it sounded like a joke. It wasn't. "Dad," she said quietly, "I built the entire pitch." "And I built the company that made the pitch possible." "That's not the same thing." He leaned back in his chair. "You want to be taken seriously? Learn patience. Not every win needs your face on it." She stared at him, and something inside her finally broke. Not loudly, not dramatically. Just the soft, final sound of a lock clicking shut. The next morning, Richard delivered her work as if it had come from his own mind. He was polished, commanding, confident. And for the first 15 minutes, Elena sat in the back of the room with a notebook in her hand, trying not to cry. Then the client's COO asked a detailed question about implementation sequencing. Richard froze, just for 2 seconds. But Elena saw it. He didn't understand the framework deeply enough to answer. So she spoke. Not out of rebellion, out of instinct. She gave a precise, brilliant answer that redirected the entire room. The clients leaned in. They asked her the next question, then the next. And by the end of the meeting, it was obvious to everyone who the real architect was. In the elevator afterward, Richard said nothing until the doors closed. Then he turned to her, voice low and cold. "You embarrassed me." Elena's face went pale. "I saved the meeting." "You made me look weak." "No," she whispered. "You did that yourself." He slapped the notebook from her hands. The sound echoed in the elevator like a gunshot. Neither of them moved. When the doors opened, Richard stepped out first. That night, Elena went home, sat on the floor of her apartment, and cried so hard she couldn't breathe. Not because he had humiliated her, because a part of her still wanted him to call. He didn't. 3 weeks later, Elena resigned. The office was stunned. Richard barely reacted. He read her letter, set it down, and said, "You're making a mistake." She had waited her whole life for him to fight for her, to ask her to stay, to say she mattered. Instead, he added, "You're not ready to lead anything on your own." Elena smiled, but her lips were shaking. "That's the first honest thing you've ever said to me," she replied. "You don't know what I'm ready for." Then she walked out carrying 1 box and 5 years of swallowed pain. For the first few months after leaving, Elena disappeared. At least that's what Richard believed. He heard she was consulting independently. He heard she'd rented a small office across town. He heard a few former clients had called asking for her. He dismissed all of it. "She'll learn," he told Marcus. "Running a firm isn't the same as cleaning up after one." Marcus said nothing. Richard should have noticed that. He should have noticed the quiet departures, too. A strategy analyst here, a project manager there, a brilliant operations lead who had once said she'd never work anywhere but Vail Strategic. They left politely, one by one. No drama, no accusations, just resignations with strangely hopeful expressions. Richard told himself younger workers were disloyal. He told himself Elena was attracting idealists who didn't understand real business. What he didn't understand was that they weren't following Elena out of rebellion. They were following her because, for the first time in their careers, someone had made them feel seen. Elena's new firm was called North Star Advisory. No one connected it to her at first because she kept her name out of the early branding. No splashy launch, no press, no announcement, just results. A failing retail chain stabilized in 6 months. A family-owned logistics company doubled profits without laying off staff. A public sector contract everyone thought was impossible got delivered under budget. And in every boardroom, Elena led the same way she wished she had been loved, calmly, personally, without making people beg for dignity. Within 2 years, North Star was being whispered about in the same circles that once belonged entirely to Richard. Within 3, it was winning contracts Vail Strategic used to secure without competition. Within 4, it had outgrown its second office. By year 5, it was the city's most talked about consultancy. Still, Richard didn't know the full truth. Not really. He knew Elena was doing well. He didn't know she was doing better than he ever had. He didn't know that several of his biggest clients had left not because of pricing, but because Elena had spent years quietly earning their trust while standing under his shadow. He didn't know Marcus had resigned 18 months after Elena left and become North Star's CFO. And he definitely didn't know the cruelest part. North Star's biggest growth years happened while Richard's company was slowly bleeding from wounds he couldn't diagnose. High staff turnover, stale strategy, client distrust, internal fear. The world around him changed. He didn't. Then came the anniversary gala, 20 years of Vail Strategic. Richard planned it as a comeback, a glossy event, press coverage, investors, former clients, civic leaders, everyone who mattered in one room, watching him reclaim control. He was certain a major acquisition deal announced that night would restore his place at the top. Backstage, as assistants rushed around him, Richard adjusted his tie and looked at the giant screen showing the company timeline. His life's work, his legacy. He felt old for the first time. Not weak, just tired, and strangely alone. He thought of calling Elena. He even picked up his phone. But pride, that old disease, won again. He put it away. The ballroom glittered with chandeliers and champagne. Richard stepped on stage to applause. He smiled into the light and began his speech. 20 years ago, he said, I built this company with nothing but conviction and sacrifice. Then the doors at the back of the room opened. Heads turned. A small delegation entered with the confidence of people who belonged everywhere important. At the center of them was Elena, wearing black, composed, beautiful in the devastating way grief can make a person beautiful. The room shifted. Whispers spread. Richard faltered for half a second, but kept going. Then the screen behind him changed. Not to the next slide in his speech, to a press release. A giant acquisition announcement. North Star Advisory acquires Vail Strategic's pending parent investor in landmark regional consolidation. The room went dead silent. Richard turned slowly. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. Because in one brutal instant, the truth landed. The investors he thought would save him had already chosen her. The acquisition deal he planned to announce was gone. North Star hadn't just surpassed him, it had outmaneuvered him at the final second and taken control of the future he thought was still his. And his daughter had known. She had known before she walked into the room. Someone in the audience whispered, "My God." Richard gripped the podium. His face lost color. Elena took one step forward, and for a moment she wasn't a CEO or a rival or a victory in heels. She was just a daughter looking at her father as he publicly fell apart. He collapsed before he hit the floor. The speech ended in screams, overturned chairs, people rushing, cameras being shoved down. And through all the chaos, Elena ran. not as his competitor, as his child. "Dad!" She dropped to her knees beside him as paramedics pushed through the crowd. Richard's eyes fluttered open once. He looked straight at her, and in that look was the most unbearable thing she had ever seen. Not anger, not humiliation, recognition. As if he were finally seeing her clearly for the first time in his life. His hand trembled toward hers. "Elena," he whispered. She grabbed it. "I'm here. I'm here." His lips moved again. This time she had to lean close to hear him. "I was proud of you," he said. The words hit her like a blade. Years too late. Spoken on a ballroom floor with strangers watching. She broke instantly. A sound came out of her that didn't sound human. All that success, all that vengeance, all those years proving him wrong. And the one sentence she had needed most arrived only when everything was already shattered. Richard survived the collapse, but not the company. Within weeks, the acquisition battle became public. Vale Strategic, weakened and over-leveraged, couldn't recover. Contracts dissolved. Senior staff fled. The firm that had carried Richard's name for 20 years was dismantled in under 6 months. He retreated from public life after that. No interviews, no conferences, no statements. Elena paid for his rehabilitation and moved him into a quiet house outside the city with a garden he never touched. She visited every weekend, just like before. Only now the silence between them had changed. It wasn't cold anymore. It was sad. Sometimes they talked about ordinary things, the weather, a book, a news story, his medication. Sometimes they sat on the porch and said nothing at all. One rainy afternoon, Richard finally asked the question that had been living between them. "Did you mean to destroy me?" Elena stared out at the wet trees for a long time. Then she answered honestly. "At first, I only wanted to survive without you." She swallowed hard. "Then I wanted to prove you wrong." She looked at him, eyes full. "And somewhere along the way, I stopped knowing where ambition ended and hurt began." Richard nodded like a man receiving a sentence he had already earned. "I taught you that," he said quietly. She didn't deny it. For the first time in his life, Richard began apologizing without defending himself. Not once, not in a grand speech, but in fragments. "I should have stood beside you. I made you compete for love. I took your gifts personally, like they were threats. I thought if I gave you too much credit, there'd be less left of me." Every apology was small. Every one landed like thunder. Elena forgave him slowly, which is the only forgiveness that feels true. Then came the final twist. 3 months after Richard moved into the house, Marcus asked Elena to meet him at North Star headquarters after hours. He looked nervous, which was unlike him. When she arrived, the office was empty except for one envelope on the conference table. Her name was written on it in Richard's handwriting. "He asked me to give you this only if his tests came back the way the doctors expected," Marcus said. Elena frowned. "What tests?" Marcus's eyes dropped. The room went still. "He has terminal pancreatic cancer," he said. "He found out before the gala." Elena felt the air leave her body. "No." "He didn't tell you because he thought you'd step back. He knew the firm was collapsing, and he knew about North Star before that night." She stared at him. Every sound in the world seemed to disappear. Marcus continued, voice breaking. "He found out months earlier. He saw the filings. He knew it was yours. He could have fought harder. He could have exposed the investor talks. He could have tried to ruin the deal." Elena's lips parted, but no words came. "He didn't," Marcus said, "because by then, he'd already decided the company should belong to the better leader." Her hands started shaking. Marcus pushed the envelope toward her. Inside was a handwritten letter. My dearest Elena, if you are reading this, then I have run out of time or courage. There are truths a weak man only learns when he is about to lose everything. You were never standing in my shadow. I was standing in your light, and I resented you for it. I knew North Star was yours. I knew the day Marcus left. I knew when our clients stopped praising the team and started asking why I had let the best mind in the building walk away. I knew long before the gala that you had become what I never allowed you to be beside me. So I made one decent decision at the end of a life full of selfish ones. I stepped aside. Not gracefully, not publicly, but I stepped aside. I let the deal happen. The collapse that humiliated me was also the only way to free you from me completely. Do not carry guilt for my ruin. I built that ruin brick by brick. Carry only this if you can bear it. I loved you badly, but I loved you with my whole heart, and I was proud of you long before I said it. Dad. By the time Elena finished reading, the paper was soaked with tears. She sank into the chair and cried the way children cry when they finally understand that the apology came, but it came from a person who could never go back and become the parent they needed. Richard died 11 days later. At the funeral, the city came in black coats and whispered versions of the same story. How brilliant he was, how feared he was, how tragic it all was. But when Elena stood to speak, she didn't talk about power or legacy or business pages. She talked about a man who never learned how to separate love from control. A man who built an empire because he didn't know how to build a home. A man who wounded the person he loved most because he could not bear to be surpassed by her. And a daughter who spent half her life chasing his approval, only to discover too late that she had possessed his pride all along. When she finished, there wasn't a dry eye in the room. North Star grew even bigger after Richard's death. International clients, new offices, recognition Richard used to dream about. But Elena changed the company's founding statement, not for branding, for herself. It read, "No one here should have to earn dignity by being overlooked first." People said it was brilliant. Only Elena knew it was a grave marker. Late at night, when the office emptied and the city lights blurred against the glass, she sometimes stood alone in silence and thought about the strange cruelty of life. She had won. She had built something better, kinder, stronger. She had become everything her father said she wasn't ready to be. And still, the one victory she could never enjoy was the one she had wanted most. To succeed while he was still healthy enough to stand beside her. To hear, "I'm proud of you," before it had to compete with regret. To be loved in time. That was the part no one on the outside understood. Success did not erase the child in her. It only gave that child a larger office to cry in. And maybe that was the real ending. Not that the daughter beat the father, but that by the time he finally saw her worth, she had already learned how expensive being unseen can become. Too expensive for a company. Too expensive for a family. Too expensive for two people who loved each other, but only figured out how to say it when almost everything was gone. This is the end. Thank you for listening. Please subscribe to our channel if you like this story.
Select now another video in our series of family and company dramas. They are all powerful stories of people coming back stronger after they have been humiliated or hurt by family members or their management. Always make sure you stay strong. Let nobody ever tell you what you are worth. You know the best. Of course.